You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I am Michael Halcomb, and this is a Fallacy of the Week episode. As always, we've got a good one for you, or a bad one actually. So what we're going to do is take a look at a meme that's been floating around. We're going to poke some holes in it, show you where the logical fallacies are. Really not poke holes in it, we're just going to show you the holes in it. And we're going to do that using just some good logic. All right, so if you're watching, I'm going to show this up on the screen. If you're just listening, I'll read it, and you should be able to follow along as well. All right, here we go. It says, by the way, at the bottom, it says it's from Heretical Theology, at Heretical Theology, which is ridiculous. I don't even want to share that with you guys, but that kind of tells you where we're heading probably. So it says, fun fact. If you're a Christian and refer to Paul as Paul instead of Saul, then you do, in fact, know how to not use a person's dead name. Whew, all right. If you're a Christian and refer to Paul as Paul instead of Saul, then you do, in fact, know how to not use a person's dead name. Man. So let's see what's going on here. So this idea of a dead name obviously is something that's floating around the trans community, and this idea that, if somebody, was born with, like, if it's a male and they're born with the male's name, like Brian, and then they decide to engage in the make-believe that they can become a woman, which they can never do. That's just make-believe. That's fake. They decide they can become a woman. They identify as a woman. They try to change their name to Brianne or something like that. And then you call them Brian, or you call them Brian, then you're referring to their dead name, the name they no longer use. And yeah, so also the same thing goes with the pronouns. If it was born a male and he has the pronouns he, him, for example, his, and then starts to identify as a female and you use the male pronouns, you're dead pronouncing them, essentially equivalent of dead naming them. So it's just all silliness. It's illogical, and it's so fallacious, right? And by the way, yeah, so this idea, I mean, nobody's saying that we don't know how to use a person's dead name or not. The issue is that we refuse to, because we refuse to play in the make-believe. But there are a few other fallacies going on here. I'm going to point out some of them to you. You're probably able to recognize them yourself, but first, right out the gate, we see a straw man fallacy going on. And, a straw man, you set up an argument that nobody's making, and then you come along and you knock it down, and it makes you look like the hero. So you're going to really misrepresent an argument or an opponent's argument to make it easier to attack and make you look like the victor, like the wise person, smart person. And so we have some of that, I think, going on here. I was just alluding to some of that. Nobody's really arguing about we don't know how to do that, right? But another thing we got here is this whole thing, Paul instead of Saul, right? So the meme is assuming that there's an argument that referring to Paul instead of Saul implies a knowledge of how to not use a person's dead name, when in fact the Apostle Paul never changed his name. He was born with the names, we anglicize them into Saul Paul, but in Hebrew, right, his name would have been something like Shaul Paula, or Shaul Paula, something like that. In Greek, it would have been Savlos Pavlos. These were his names from birth. It's evangelical mythology that Paul changed his name. This plays into the idea of, like, a Christian name, or you get a new name at your baptism. And it preaches well, like, this transformation, you get a new name, but that's not what happened. Paul never got a new name. Saul Paul was always his name from birth. That's what his parents named him. And he had one parent of Semitic descent and one from Roman descent. And so he got a Hebrew and Gentile name, a Roman name. And what he learned to do was to use those names strategically for ministry purposes. So when he was engaging Semitic people, Jews, right, then he would use Shaul or Savlos. And when he was engaging Gentiles, Roman and Greeks, he would use Pavlos, right, which is actually a diminutive name. It means like little guy or something like that. But so there's like this self-deprecation going on even in the name. But this argument's assuming that some people are arguing that referring to Paul instead of Saul implies that, oh yeah, we know how to not use a person's dead name, when that has nothing to do with it. Right? It has nothing to do with it. Paul never changed his name. Right? So this practice of referring to Paul instead of Saul in the case of the apostle is an unrelated concept, completely unrelated concept of a dead name. Saul was never a dead name for Paul. He took that name to his grave, right? So it's not a valid comparison whatsoever in any sense at all. Okay? So that's important. Also, I see another fallacy here, in addition to that straw man one, is what we call a false equivalence fallacy. And this is where you treat two different things as if they're equivalent, when in fact they're not. For example, equating the practice of using Paul for the apostle with understanding how to not use a person's dead name, right? In the previous, we're talking about how to use a person's dead name, but equating the practice of using Paul for the apostle with understanding how to not use a person's dead name. Well, when the situations are actually entirely dissimilar, is absolutely fallacious. So we can refute this idea by saying, using Paul for the apostle Saul is a matter of historical reference, right? And linguistic and missional adaptation. It has no connection to this modern issue that people are all sensitive about using a so-called trans person's dead name. Again, dissimilar matters, distinct matters, and so this is a false equivalency fallacy right alongside the straw man fallacy. We also have going on here, I think, perhaps a hasty generalization fallacy. And if you've been watching these videos or listening to these podcasts for a long time, these fallacy ones, right? Usually you're going to have like a hasty generalization. Usually you're going to have an ad hom or a straw man. Those are very, very common. So here the hasty generalization is you're drawing a broad conclusion based on insufficient evidence. That's what a hasty generalization. You generalizing, you come into a conclusion and hastily applying it across the board. So you're drawing a broad conclusion across the board based on insufficient evidence, right? And so the example is that anyone who refers to Paul instead of Saul must inherently understand how to not use a person's dead name. But if you go back into antiquity and said that to somebody, they'd look at you like you're a moron, right? So people use Paul for the apostle for various reasons. And it doesn't necessarily imply knowledge or understanding of transgender issues, right? And it hasn't throughout time. It still doesn't apply. This is making this kind of sweeping generalizations unwarranted. The same would go the other way. Like anyone who, people use Saul for the apostle, right? For various reasons. It doesn't necessarily imply knowledge or understanding of trans issues. This is a hasty generalization fallacy. And finally, I'll just point out we have a non sequitur fallacy going on here. This just means in Latin non sequitur doesn't follow. And so this is where somebody will draw a conclusion that doesn't logically follow from the premise, right? So a premise is a stated thing a position you write from. And the conclusion is what you draw from the premise, the thing or position that was written from. Well, the statement here implies that using Paul instead of Saul indicates knowledge about not using a person's dead name. This is a non sequitur. Now, there's absolutely no logical connection between the two. None. No logical connection between using Paul for the apostle and understanding the sensitivity of not using a transgender person's so-called fake dead name. These are entirely unrelated concepts, right? So, yeah, we have here a straw man fallacy, maybe a false equivalent, and these all kind of overlap in this meme, by the way. We have a straw man fallacy, a false equivalence fallacy, a hasty generalization fallacy, a non sequitur fallacy. And so, what we got to be careful about, what people got to be careful about, what we got to be aware of is, right, when baseless claims are made, baseless assumptions are made, and those lead to baseless claims being made and sweeping generalizations about unrelated topics. It just leads to really flawed arguments, flawed information dissemination, and it's really pitiful. It's really sad. And sometimes I see people who call themselves Christians, even some who would go by the title professor, doing this sort of thing, and it's just really sad and really unfortunate. And you know what? I've said this before, people are like, it amazes me how much people are willing to die on the hill of memes. Yeah? They'll defend the logical fallaciousness to their death, right? And it's silly. They shouldn't. So I'm gonna stop there. This one's just ridiculous. Yeah, but I hope that clarifies. So I'll stop there and say I hope that helped.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.